All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to do a quick introduction. I'm Brian Leach, and I'm the CEO of Unboxed Training and Technology. And then with me today, I have one of our partners, Stephen Bear. Stephen, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. My name's Steve Bear. I'm the managing partner of the game agency and certainly excited to be on this webinar. Thanks for joining.
We are so excited to have everyone join us today. And just to cover a few logistics before we get started, just to let you know that the line is muted, but if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to enter those in the chat box, and we're going to answer those towards the end of the presentation. And then second, following the conclusion of the webinar, you're going to be prompted to fill out a brief 4-question survey. We would just love to hear your thoughts on the content of the presentation. But also you can request things like a copy of our recording or our latest premium content and a chance to pre-register for our next webinar called Learning in Action, How to Increase Your Training ROI with Action Learning Projects. So that'll come towards the end. Very good. All right, well, we're going to get started this morning. I know we've got about 30 minutes or so here with you. And we're going to cover 3 things today during the webinar. We're going to talk about where and how often to embed games in a learning journey, how to select game types that meet your learning objectives, and how to get started with games. So before we get started, we thought it would be a little fun to get some feedback from you. This is where we can start to test your chat box to see what are your favorite games, whether it's a console, mobile, board games, card games. We'd love to hear what is your favorite game, and Stephen's going to kind of rattle a few of those off as they come in for us. So please go ahead and do that in the chat box.
I see someone just wrote Scrabble.
Yeah. Oh, I see Cards Against Humanity is another game. Yeah. PC games, console games. Here is one, Catan. All right, I like that game. Man, there's a lot of these good ones coming in, Stephen. Solitaire, there's another good one. I can play Solitaire for hours on my mobile phone. Jeopardy, very good. Good stuff. Kingdom Hearts, okay, that's funny. All right, well, this is good. Well, thank you. This is awesome to see the different games that everyone loves to play. We all, I'm sure, have engaged with games at some point in our life, and they're a part of our daily routines. I have to admit, Words with Friends, I kind of really geek out on. But, you know, there's a lot of games. And, Stephen, I thought you could just talk about games in general and what people can, and kind of the skills and the things that they learn while they're in a game.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that all of these games, and it's funny because some of the ones that we have here, some of the ones we just heard in the chat box, all these games, and certainly games as a whole, have in common are really 3 things. All of them have rule sets, they have strategies, and they have goals. And I'm a firm believer that you can take that concept and map it to learning and making learning a lot more fun, a lot more engaging, and certainly a lot more game-like. And we've taken many of the mechanics that you have here on this screen and applied game concepts to learning, and taken what I think historically people have made, you know, what I always call chocolate-covered broccoli, you know, calling a quiz a game, and escalating it to really making a game and infusing learning into it. And so we'll talk about that on this webinar in the coming slides.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons that Unboxed has teamed up with the game agency is that we just saw a huge opportunity for gaming in our learning journey, in the curriculum that we design for our clients as a training provider and technology provider for training. And our partnership with Stephen and his company, the game agency, is one that we love. And we're going to share some of the learnings that we've had together and some of the best practices that Stephen has brought to share with us here at Unboxed. And hopefully you can start to incorporate gaming into your training too. You know, we're trying to solve a big problem in gaming. Really, if you think about the modern learner, they're very distracted. You know, they're consuming over 11 hours of media on average a day. They get interrupted every 5 minutes inside of their day. And of course, the attention span is getting lower, as we all know, 90 seconds on average. And so it's like, how do we really engage that modern learner and really keep them into the content that we're trying to teach? And games can be a great way to engage people with social and competitive elements that heighten attention, sustain focus, and drive action. And Stephen talked a little bit about that earlier. Games are also a safe place to learn, fail, reinforce knowledge, and increase retention. And we're going to talk more about how they're great around knowledge, and then what the repetitiveness play, of a game can do to really increase that retention. And you'll see that come to life through the webinar here today. There's some phenomenal results that Stephen's received that I think he's going to share. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, sorry to jump on top of you. We recently did a study of 1,000 games using a product that we have called the Training Arcade, which we'll show you momentarily. And what's really fantastic is we saw the real value in action here. So all the games that we're going to showcase that are specific to this study are what I would call micro games. They are 5 to 10 minutes in nature. But we saw a few things. We saw among these games, first of all, the average game was played for a little over 6 minutes, a stat that I don't have here, but it was played 3 times or 2.9 times. So a learner would come in, they'd play it, and then on their own accord, they'd come back another 2 times to play. And one of the things that we've been talking about with Unbox, and certainly other folks in the industry, is that it's rare that a learner says, gosh, I really enjoyed that learning so much, I want to come back another 2 times to experience it. So that's fantastic, because as a result, they came back 2 more times, and it drove the knowledge into their brains on a much deeper level. So much so that we saw a 64% lift in knowledge. One of the things that we're doing is, in our games, we're using what we call the corrective feedback paradigm. If you think about it more like flashcards, right? Reintroducing questions as someone is getting it wrong, just a few down the path, and giving them another opportunity to get it right. Also making sure that we're reinforcing why it's wrong or why it's right, to make sure that they understand the theory behind the question. Once again, I think what's fantastic here is we're seeing that people are coming for short periods of time. They're coming back over and over again, and it's working and driving real knowledge and ultimately real retention, which is, I think, all of our goal on this call.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we can incorporate those games into a learning journey, and how they can be leveraged here. And if you think about learning, we have a continuous learning framework here at Unbox that we use with our clients that we call Prepare, Perform, and Improve. Prepare is that knowledge acquisition, the skill practice that a learner goes through. Perform is the on-the-job application and any sort of execution tools that we may have to help people while they're actually engaging with a customer or in a real work scenario. And Improve is really the sustainment part. It's the coaching and measurement and reinforcement. And if done well, Improve kind of loops back in to Prepare and kind of informs what a learner should do next. And of course, there's a lot being done with machine learning and AI to really help inform this cycle, which is very, very exciting in our industry. If we take an example of just a sales journey, this is a very high-level view of some steps that we're, a sales program we have here called Ready Set. But, in week 1, let's assume that we're exploring needs. There's and learner may go through a baseline assessment. They may take a self-paced e-learning, have some on-the-job activities. In week 2, as they're designing a solution, they may take another self-paced e-learning on how to, design that actual solution, go out on the job, do some activities. And then right here, we have a phenomenal opportunity to reinforce exploring needs by inserting a game into that learning journey. And that's allowing us to continue measuring the retention and what the learner had learned back in week 1. And keep moving through that journey. You can see we're in week 3 and we're learning how to go for the sale, taking a self-paced learning, doing some on-the-job activities. And here again, we've put another reinforcement game in to reinforce the previous week's learning. And, of course, I'm using self-paced examples. This could be instructor-led, any sort of modality that you may use. But in that fourth week, we here again, we're repeating the self-paced learning, the activities, and reinforcing the previous week, and then kind of ending with that final assessment to really see what our learners retained. And so at a very high level, gaming is a great way to reinforce information, knowledge, and to some level, some skills that a learner may pick up throughout that learning journey. Stephen's going to share a few examples of just different ways gaming has been applied both in e-learning and in the instructor-led environment. So Stephen, please do that.
Yeah, so I want to reinforce something that Brian said. Games are, I think, most of all, a fantastic tool to reinforce, right? They're not meant to replace. They're certainly meant to augment or enhance the training that is already being done. In many ways, they act as a practice playground based on what you've just taught, and it allows someone to dig into the material, see what they know, reinforce what they don't know, and give them an opportunity to try over and over again in a safe environment. So the first example I'm going to give here is a game-based course that we just completed for a major financial institution. It's one of the largest banks worldwide. They have 7,000 risk officers and across 9 different business units. And one of the things we were asked to do is to try to figure out how can we start to set up different scenarios to help them understand a whole bunch of ways to address risk management based on different stakeholders' needs within the organization. So really having them talk to anywhere from marketing to legal to compliance and so on and so forth, and really understand the journey, if you will, of a risk officer and the repercussions, good, bad, or ugly, of the decisions that you're making. We built out really a story-based simulation, and then gave them a lot of activities to make decisions that they would using their traditional software in the office, but replicated it within the course. And then also a lot of mini games to just reinforce key information and see what people know. And I want to kind of talk about not just the fact that it's a good tool, games, to augment what the course is doing, but it's also a great tool to weave in and out of training to give people little breakpoints to talk about, rather to try different techniques. This next slide that I'm showing you here is really meant to bring to life the fact that games can come in all shapes and sizes, and I mean that actually in 3 different ways. The first thing is that they're extraordinarily applicable to lots of topics. So that one happened to be focused on teaching somebody about risk management. Well, you can do, and some of that is process, some of that's product, some of that's soft skills, some of that, but you can apply that to other things too. You can focus on compliance training. You can focus on product training, sales training, management training. All these examples that I have here are different topics just along those lines. So that's the first thing you can think about when you're thinking about games. Also, the last example I gave is certainly a 2D, simple, kitschy look, right? And fun and whimsical in manner. And that was by design. You can go 2D, you can go 3D, and you can certainly make it as immersive or as real as you want to. And then you start to think about technology, and that's a third thing we think about when it comes to taking e-learning games. You can build something that is accessible just by mobile devices and allows you to dig in little micro content. You can go as far as something that is using more hot topics like virtual reality, and going as far as getting goggles on people and having them really fully immersed into an environment. There's lots of stuff you can do to take your e-learning and build games into it that's really going to drive someone into a story, help someone understand different characters, understand different processes, and try something out and see what sticks and what doesn't, and fail and learn in the process of doing so. Brian, yeah, perfect. And then so this next slide talks about not just what you can do from an e-learning standpoint, but how you can take games and apply them to instructor-led training. And very similarly to what Brian was talking about, it being a reinforcement tool, we at the game agency and actually with Unbox have recently been working with a number of clients on instructor-led training events. And that could be anywhere from new employee onboarding to, in particular, TGA and Unbox have been doing a number of sales meetings together and thinking about how do you take your traditional training in the form of slides or videos and then really loop in games and activities and polls to engage people in a breakout session, whether it's at a tabletop of 10 working together, whether it's having groups of 3 to 5 people walking around rooms to different kiosks, whether it's doing a scavenger hunt, but really getting people to embrace the content and to reinforce the information. And then layering on top of that, gamification components, which is something that both the game agency and Unbox really believe in. Thinking about leaderboards, thinking about prizing, thinking about badging. So you can really take the combination of games and gamification techniques and apply them to instructor-led training and make it a much more immersive, much more competitive, much more collaborative, and much more fun experience. And as a result, a much more successful training experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've learned a lot working with TGA and how to really bring gaming into the actual instructor-led event. And Stephen, that's a phenomenal example. And of course, it's fun for the learner, right? Which is really cool. I want to take a few minutes and transition to talk about, how to choose the right type of game that meets your learning objectives. And that's important. And we've been using a platform that the game agency has created called the Training Arcade. And I'll have Stephen talk about this, but it's a phenomenal authoring tool. Think of any sort of other authoring tool like you have, like Articulate, Captivate, things like that any learning instructor can use to actually create games. And so, Stephen, I'll let you talk a little bit about the Training Arcade and some of the different games that are available.
Yeah, thank you. So the Training Arcade was born about 2 years ago based on some data that we saw in the marketplace. They said that the average game could be built in a rapid authoring tool in just about 90 hours. And our take over here was that didn't feel very rapid. So we wanted to build the Training Arcade to really make that a much quicker and quite honestly, as well as a much more gamified experience. So we launched the Training Arcade about a year and a half ago. Today it has 8 games in it, and I'll kind of run through them super quick, and we can dig into them deeper if anybody wants to. But the first one is Jeopardy! We launched this actually most recently, and we did this in collaboration with Sony Productions, and it takes the Jeopardy! Game to life. It uses actually the voiceover of Johnny Gilbert, who is on the show. It uses a lot of their scenes and a lot of their assets, and it brings the game to life in a meaningful way. And you can build any of these in 15 to 30 minutes, by the way. The second game is Trivia. Much like all the games, it has a combination of gamification components. So you have your point system, you have your leaderboard system, a streak system, a timer system. You can turn on or off any of this stuff. And by the way, I think it's really important is not just picking a game for game's sake, but picking a game that is going to align most effectively with your performance objectives, your skill set objectives, and making sure that it is a game that's going to successfully reinforce that information, that goal of what you want people to learn. Why don't we jump to the next slide? Those first 3 games are certainly very quick in nature, but I want to actually on this slide specifically focus on scenarios. So you have your technical skills and your process skills. What I love about scenarios is it really is about soft skills. It's about engaging someone to go down a branching path with other characters and try out different techniques. Great for sales skills, great for customer service, management training, negotiation training. I really love using this to see not only what people know, but more importantly, how they behave, and using that data to understand where they belong most effectively with my organization or how I can improve their performance to make them even more effective. Let me jump to the next slide, if you will, Brian. These last 2 games are what I would call our gamiest of the games. So we have an endless jumper and we have a match game. And what I like about these is these are certainly the most addictive of the games. Endless Jumper is kind of based off of Doodle Jump. Match is based off of Candy Crush. The idea is to have a game that someone's going to want to stick with for a long period of time, that is going to allow you to reinforce key information along the way. And it really goes back to the concept of making sure that you can, every few questions, deliver information to people that's going to reinforce it over and over again. And that is that paradigm that we're talking about earlier on. The next slide I think is really important. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, measurement, Stephen. This is something that nobody really cares about, right? So, yeah, please go ahead.
well, we believe in, and this is something that that TGA, the game agency, and Unbox talk about all the time together, is that a game's not worth doing if you're not going to measure it. Ultimately, this is where the real value is, right? Yes, it's great to engage people. Yes, it's critical to reinforce information. But if you're not able to look at the data behind people's interactions, you might as well not do it. So it's, I think, great to look at, the raw data, how many people are actually engaging with it, game scores and ranks and sessions, what's correct and what's incorrect. The one thing actually we don't have on the slide that we look at together a lot is what I was mentioning earlier is behavioral trends. Really understanding who is this person, what are their behaviors, what do we glean as far as their personas, and how do we make them most effective within an organization? And I think there's a lot of amazing data that you can get out of games, in that they are true simulations, if done effectively, of the workplace. And you can really understand that person and make sure that you can either help improve their performance or find a place where they might perform even more effectively within your organization.
Excellent. I want to take a moment and share, talking about results, some of the registration results that we had. If you recall, when you registered for this webinar, we actually put you in a real live game using the Training Arcade. And, using the same sort of format that Stephen shared earlier, Stephen, we had over 222 registrants come in. And so why don't you talk to us a little bit about how this data feels to you, Stephen, for a quick registration game?
Yeah, I would say that this is very much in alignment with that study of 1,000 games up above. So if you remember before, we showed that the average person comes in and they play our games within the Training Arcade 2.9 times. So great to see that people came, they played, and they were incentivized either with intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, but they were incentivized to play over and over again. That's great. We also saw that in this case, actually, it was a slightly smaller play time in that, each session was a little over a minute, and people came back for a total of 2 minutes and 12 seconds. But I think the most important thing is we saw that within that 2 minutes, there's a 49% lift in knowledge using the corrective paradigm concept, corrective feedback paradigm concept. And that, once again, just as you think about from a designing perspective, it's putting questions in, reinforcing those questions behind just a few questions later, and making sure that almost flashcard-like, people are seeing that information, and if they don't understand it to begin with, they will understand it certainly by the time that they're done with this game. So in a 2-minute period of time, we almost had a 50% increase in knowledge, which I'm very pleased with.
Yeah. Heck, that's awesome. If you can get a result in 2 minutes, of learning to really move someone's knowledge forward, that's pretty effective. We also wanted to talk a little bit about what we call the 5 W's and the 1 H. A lot of you are probably like, how in the world do we get started? How do we even think about games? We've talked a lot about, where they can fit in the curriculum, how they can be used in e-learning, how they can be used in instructor-led, how they can be used to reinforce small bits of knowledge in that learning journey. And so, we've got some tips for you to kind of go through here. And Stephen, I'm going to cover these, and please add in any additional insight that you have. I mean, we want to obviously know who your target audience is, what motivates them, and what sort of learner are they? Obviously, talking about the performance objectives that you may have. What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to move a behavior forward? Are you trying to increase knowledge or reinforce something that you've already taught? what skill gaps that you have for improvement. So if you think about that learning journey that I shared earlier, we were very strategic in that journey to reinforce knowledge gained in a previous week. That was our intent, to really drive sustainment of the program, and that was really our goal. Talk about when you want to roll it out. Is it going to be an e-learning or an instructor-led event? Obviously, if it's going to be an instructor-led event, there's going to have to be some level of planning that goes along with that to have the devices ready for folks to play, which is kind of obvious but important to know. And really deciding, why is the game more effective than text, video, lectures? And Stephen, I'm going to ask you to talk about that one in a moment, because I think that's one that you'll have some point of view on, and how you can incent players, which is really important, and really motivate them and reward them outside the game too, not just in the game. And so, Stephen, I'd love for you to just kind of layer on just some of your experiences here in these ways that we think about using games.
Yeah, so by all means. So when we look at number one, you think about the target audience. One of the things we're thinking about is across the board, who are they? What functions are they in? What geos are they in? Does this need to be a multilingual experience? Do you want this to be a competitive or collaborative experience? And then also, just based on your audience, and most of us are training really a broad spectrum of people, but can we see any commonalities that say, gosh, this audience would really like this type of game mechanic? So that we think about that, certainly. I'm going to couple number 2 and number 3 together, and honestly, it's about thinking about, first and foremost, this goes back to almost like a taxonomy alignment. What performance objectives are we trying to address, and as a result, what skills need to be improved to address that? And I think that's really critical, because I think you can very effectively align the right game mechanic based on that question. I do believe that based on when this will be rolled out, is it going to be part of an e-learning experience? Is it going to be part of a instructor-led training experience? Really understanding that will help also identify, what do you want that game experience to be like? Do you want that to be competitive? Do you want that to be collaborative? Do you want it to be a very small portion of the experience? Do you want it to be woven in every 30 minutes into an experience? How do you want to do that? To answer Brian's question about why is a game more effective than text or video or lecture, once again, it's not meant to replace, it's meant to augment. And I would say our opinion is that text, video, and lecture is a very passive way of training. Games are a very active way of training, right? It just takes it takes you from listening to actually digging in and participating. And the last part is about incentivizing the player, right? And this is something that is a lot of overlap in what the game agency and Unbox focuses on, which is the gamification layer. And I would maybe talk about the difference between what is gamification and what is games, right? So gamification is your point system, your leaderboard system, your badge system, your prize system, all the things that are little features, if you will, within a game, versus the game itself, which is the storyline, actually engaging and playing the game mechanic itself. So I think you need to think about, how do you layer on those incentives? What is going to incentivize someone? Is it going to be points? Is it going to be badges? Is it going to be leaderboards? Is it going to be prizes? Is it going to be something else? And making sure that that's part of your strategy.
Absolutely. And in using the training arcade, Stephen, there's obviously a leaderboard built in, but you're thinking beyond just the game in itself when you're talking about gamification. That's actually a question that has come in, so I think you may have answered our first question that came in from one of our listeners out here, which is awesome. Well, it's hard to believe we've almost spent 30 minutes talking about games, Stephen, but we have our contact information here, so you can certainly reach out to Stephen or myself with any sort of follow-up questions. We both kind of geek out talking about learning and gamification. I think we're proud to say that, Stephen, that we're good learning geeks, I guess. And we wanted to take a few minutes here and just open up the webinar to get a few questions coming in. And Stephen, I have one that came in here quickly that said, should we be using games in lieu of quizzes? And I thought I'll just take that one to get us started and let you layer in any additional insights. I think both are important. I use quizzes inside of e-learning to just get a test of knowledge and to really enforce information along the journey inside of e-learning, for example. But I love a game as a way to drive sustainment and reinforcement, maybe after the fact. And you saw in the learning journey example that we shared, we were using that game strategically a week later, as reinforcement. Stephen, anything you want to add there to that question?
No, I would agree. I think that there's two parts to that. I think that one is I think a quiz is a great assessment tool. I think a game is a great reinforcement tool, and I think that's the distinction between the two. And I think that you can layer a game later on, or you can layer games as mini mechanics throughout your training. So if you looked at that, that 4-panel chart that Brian had up earlier, it's about weaving it into your journey along the way as a way to reinforce that content and actually have someone practice stuff in a safe environment. So I think that's how I would differentiate the two. I think one is assessment, one is reinforcement, and certainly games are more of a practice playground than a quiz.
Stephen, we got a great question here. It's what is the best way to justify games to stakeholders that believe games are juvenile?
It's a great question. So I think it's all about the data. The reality is, and this goes back to, and I'm obviously extremely biased on this, but if you look at other forms of training in nature, the vast majority of them are very passive in nature, right? There's not a lot of data you can get on what your employees know based on lectures or reading material or videos that is being delivered to them. But if you can actually get them to engage into a game and try out different techniques and be able to look at not only what they know but how they behave, you are equipped with way more information on your employee than you are otherwise. So to us, the gold is in the data, and it really helps the organizations out in a much more meaningful way than any other medium as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, Stephen, we got a couple of good questions around are games compatible with learning management systems? And the answer is yes. And the Training Arcade works with learning management systems. And I know all the other custom game experiences do too. Anything you want to add there, Stephen?
Well, yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that when we're designing games, whether they're custom or they're using the Training Arcade, we take into account a few things. We take into account not just, obviously the game experience and the data behind it, but building it out so that you can get much deeper information within a game, but also that they're packaged up as SCORM or XAPI packages so that they can plug right into LMSs, so that they can be delivered as components, as often web objects, right into rapid authoring tools. So if you're using Captivate or Storyline or Lectora, we build for that. We also built into most of our games a really straightforward SSO integration. So we try to, and this is something that certainly the game agency and Unbox believe in, is let's not make it a hassle for the trainer or the learner. Let's make sure that it really integrates smoothly into the user experience.
Yeah. All right, Stephen, we'll take one last question here, and they're coming in. And the question we had is, how do you measure the ROI for a game or using a game? And I think we hit this a little bit earlier, but I think obviously the measurement component of this is pretty important. And heck, we showed how we used a game for this webinar to really increase knowledge in 2 minutes. And so, Stephen, any thoughts that you have on return on investment, the big question that we get asked all the time?
Yeah, so I'm a real believer that if you're going to use a game, you should have some baseline data. So if you're going to, I think it's always critical to make sure you understand what your audience's knowledge is prior to your training. So we often do pre and post test analysis. That could be, by the way, going back to the question about a quiz versus a game, it could be in the form of a quiz just to understand what's the baseline across 5 or 10 key pieces of information prior and after the training. And I think you will quite honestly find we have in almost every instance a tremendous lift in knowledge with the use of games, and they prove their effectiveness just in the data itself. And I think that's the best way to show whether it's based on people's knowledge, people's retained knowledge, so testing them again 3 or 6 months later on it, or excuse me, having a real understanding beyond what you do today as to people's behaviors, or tendencies.
Yeah, and Steve, that's a great point. When we design curriculums here at Unboxed, we are using games for a good sustainment strategy. If you think of that 30, 60, 90-day period, they're great ways to engage a learner, after they've already been through the training. And to your point, you've already maybe have done that pre and post assessment. And then you can also see kind of where they are when they start that game, compared to that post assessment, and how they are after playing the game. And we always see improvement and a lift, which is great because people forget things right after time. And if they're not applying them or putting it into practice, it's a great way to engage that learner with reinforcement. So, well, Stephen, we have gone past our time. We're 5 minutes over. So I just want to really thank everyone for joining us, and encourage you to fill out the survey at the end, giving Stephen and I some feedback. We'd love that feedback. And if there's any additional materials you want to request, you can certainly do that there. And Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been so fun doing this, and I appreciate your time too.
Well, likewise. Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining. Happy to answer any questions, and certainly really enjoyed our time together.
All right, everybody, have a great day.